They laughed when he spent his last coins on rusted metal. 3 weeks later, nobody was laughing anymore. He bought an abandoned military hangar for 50 cents, then discovered why no pilot dared to fly from there again. James Callahan stood in the dusty military auction yard, holding his last coins while the wealthiest contractors in the state laughed at him. The auction had just ended and somehow, impossibly, he had won the bid on the abandoned hangar at Harrison Air Force Base. 50 cents. It was all he had. Colonel Marcus Sterling wiped tears from his eyes, still laughing loudly. Beside him, other contractors in expensive suits shook their heads in disbelief. None of them understood what James had noticed during his brief inspection the week before. The hangar sat in the middle of the desert, its corrugated metal walls rusted and full of holes. The massive sliding doors hung crooked on their tracks, like broken jaws that could no longer close. Every contractor had walked past it, dismissing it as worthless scrap metal. The official listing called it a total loss, suitable only for demolition and salvage. But James had seen something they hadn't, something that made his hands shake as he counted his meager coins. The way the afternoon sun hit the concrete floor inside revealed marks that shouldn't exist on ordinary pavement. Not cracks or oil stains, but deliberate patterns. Symbols carved into the concrete that formed coordinates, the kind used by pilots to mark navigation routes. These weren't random scratches. They were taxi markings, the painted lines that guide aircraft on the ground. But they were arranged in a pattern that made no sense for normal operations, unless you knew how to read them, unless you had been trained in the old ways, before everything was digital and computerized. James had been trained in those ways. 50 years ago, his commander had taught him how intelligence officers hid information in plain sight, how they used standard military symbols to encode messages that looked like normal base operations to anyone who didn't know better. As the crowd dispersed, still muttering about the foolish old man who threw away his last money, James approached his purchase. The key felt heavy in his weathered palm. It was an actual metal key, not a key card or electronic lock. That alone told him this place was from a different era. Behind him, he could hear Sterling telling his associates that some people never learned their place, that the military surplus business was for serious men with serious money, not for washed-up old-timers playing with their retirement fantasies. But when James inserted the key into the rusted padlock and heard it click open, something inside the hangar shifted. It wasn't just settling metal or wind. It was a sound like hydraulics releasing pressure, mechanical systems waking up after decades of sleep. The door groaned as he pulled it open. The sound echoed across the empty base, carrying farther than it should have. Inside, shafts of sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets waiting to be revealed. The interior defied every expectation. While the outside walls showed decades of neglect, the inside told a different story. The concrete floor, though dusty, was intact, solid. The support beams stood straight and true, bearing no signs of the structural failure the auction documents had claimed. James stepped inside, his boots echoing in the vast, empty space. The sound was wrong somehow. Too clear, too resonant, like the building was larger than its exterior suggested. He moved toward the center of the floor where he had glimpsed those strange markings during his inspection. Up close, they were even more puzzling. Painted in faded yellow were what looked like standard taxi lines and parking spots for aircraft. But woven between them, visible only if you knew what pattern to look for, were coordinates. His heart began to race as he traced the patterns with his eyes. These were navigation coordinates, the kind used for flight routes, but they were painted on the ground, inside a hangar. That made no sense unless whoever placed them wanted to hide the information, wanted it to look like normal base markings to anyone who didn't understand the code. James pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. It was worn, the leather cover cracked with age. Inside were pages his commander had given him 5 decades ago, pages filled with codes, symbols, and navigation techniques from an era when secrecy meant the difference between life and death. His hands trembled as he found the right page. The taxi markings weren't just coordinates. They were a map, a spiral pattern that led from the walls toward the center of the structure, each symbol corresponding to a direction and distance measurement in his commander's system. Every contractor in the state had walked across this floor for years, seeing only cracked concrete and oil stains, seeing only worthlessness. Before he could follow the pattern further, heavy footsteps approached the hangar entrance. James looked up to see Sterling standing in the doorway, his expensive hat casting shadows across his tanned face. The colonel stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete. His eyes swept the hangar interior with new interest, no longer dismissive, but calculating. "Callahan," Sterling said, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "I've been thinking about your little purchase here." James said nothing. He carefully closed his notebook and slipped it back into his pocket, making sure Sterling didn't see what he had been studying. "You know," Sterling continued, walking slowly around the perimeter, "I may have been too hasty in letting this property go so cheap. There's valuable scrap metal here. The land itself could be worth something if properly developed." He stopped about 20 feet from James, his hands clasped behind his back like a general inspecting troops. "I'm prepared to offer you $5 for it. That's 10 times what you paid. Quite generous for a pile of rusted metal, wouldn't you say?" But James had seen the hunger in Sterling's eyes, the way his gaze kept returning to the floor markings, the way his confident posture couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't generosity. This was desperation disguised as a business offer. "I appreciate the offer, Colonel," James said quietly, "but I'm not interested in selling." The words hung in the empty hangar like a challenge. Sterling's facade of friendliness cracked like dried leather. "Not interested?" Sterling took a step closer. "Old man, I don't think you understand your situation. This is military surplus property. There are regulations, inspections. A man your age with your resources could find himself buried in paperwork and violations before he even knew what hit him." The threat was clear, wrapped in bureaucratic language. "You spent your last 50 cents on this place," Sterling continued. "You have no money for lawyers, no money for the restoration work the county will require, no money for anything. You made an impulsive purchase and now you're in over your head." James felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the cool air inside the hangar. Sterling wasn't wrong about his financial situation. He had gambled everything on this purchase, on the hope that his instincts were correct. "I understand plenty, Colonel," James finally replied. "I understand that you're mighty interested in something you claimed was worthless yesterday. Makes a man wonder what changed your mind." Sterling's face flushed red above his collar. "You impudent old fool. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I own 3 aerospace companies. I have contracts with the Department of Defense worth millions. And you, a nobody with nothing, think you can talk back to me? Respect isn't bought with contracts, Colonel," James said, his voice steady. "It's earned. And from what I've seen, you earn yours through intimidation, not merit." For a moment, Sterling looked like he might physically attack him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then he took a deep breath and forced his expression back into something resembling control. "You're making a serious mistake, Callahan," he said quietly. "This region has ways of dealing with people who don't understand their place. Accidents happen, old hangars collapse, elderly men get lost in the desert looking for help that never comes." He let the threat hang in the air, then turned and walked toward the entrance. At the doorway, he paused and looked back. "I'll give you until tomorrow to reconsider. After that, well, I can't be held responsible for what happens to stubborn old men who refuse reasonable offers." Sterling's footsteps faded into the distance. James stood alone in the hangar, his knees nearly buckling with the release of tension. But Sterling's threats only strengthened his resolve. He had seen something here, something important, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the holes in the roof at a different angle now. The light hit the floor markings in a new way, revealing details he hadn't noticed before. The pattern wasn't just coordinates. It was a spiral that led directly to the center of the hangar floor. James knelt down, ignoring the protest from his old knees. In the exact center of the building, barely visible under decades of dust and oil, was a seam. Not a crack. A seam. Perfectly straight. Perfectly measured. His pulse quickened as he brushed away more dirt. The seam formed a square, roughly 10 feet on each side. And in one corner, hidden beneath what looked like a drainage grate, was a small metal plate with a symbol stamped into it. The symbol of the 437th Strategic Operations Wing, a unit that officially never existed, a unit that his commander had served with during operations that were still classified. James sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This wasn't just an abandoned hangar. This was a storage facility, a hidden depot for something valuable enough that they had encoded its location in floor markings that looked like normal taxi lines. And Sterling knew. Or at least suspected. That's why he wanted the property. That's why his offer had jumped from mockery to threats in less than 24 hours. James needed help. He couldn't excavate whatever was beneath this floor alone, and he couldn't protect it from Sterling without witnesses. But who could he trust? Who in this town had enough integrity to stand up to a man like Sterling? As darkness began to fall outside, James locked the hangar door behind him and started the long walk back to his small rental room at the edge of town. His mind was already working on a plan. He had faced worse odds before, in places far more dangerous than a desert town in Nevada. The question wasn't whether he had the courage to continue. It was whether he could move fast enough to uncover the truth before Sterling found a way to take it all away. That night, James couldn't sleep. Every shadow outside his window seemed to move with purpose. Every sound carried the weight of potential threat. Sterling's words echoed in his mind. Accidents happen. Old hangars collapse. He sat at the small table in his rented room, studying his commander's notebook by the light of a battery-powered lamp. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with handwritten notes and diagrams that most people would mistake for random sketches. But James knew better. Each symbol, each notation, was part of a system designed to hide information in plain sight. His commander, Colonel Raymond Hayes, had been a master of operational security during the Cold War. He had taught James that the best way to protect a secret wasn't to bury it deep, but to hide it where everyone could see it but no one would recognize it. The floor markings in the hangar matched the patterns in the notebook perfectly. Standard taxi lines to anyone else. But to someone trained in Hayes's methods, they were a map, a set of instructions leading to something buried beneath the concrete. As dawn approached, James made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He needed someone he could trust, someone with the technical knowledge to help him excavate safely, and someone with enough standing in the community that Sterling couldn't simply make them disappear. He dressed quickly and made his way to the general store on Main Street. It was the oldest business in town, run by a woman named Sarah Mitchell. She had lived here her entire life, and more importantly, her late husband had been an Air Force engineer stationed at Harrison Base back in the 70s. The bell above the door chimed as James entered. Sarah looked up from behind the counter where she was organizing receipts. She was in her early 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes sharp and assessing. "James Callahan," she said, her voice neutral. "Heard you made quite the purchase yesterday. Whole town's talking about the crazy old man who spent his last money on a pile of scrap." James approached the counter slowly. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important. Something that involves your husband's work at the base." Her expression changed immediately. The casual shopkeeper vanished, replaced by someone intensely focused. "Robert's been gone 15 years. What could you possibly need to know about his work? Did he ever mention the 437th Strategic Operations Wing?" Sarah's face went pale. She quickly moved to the door, flipped the sign to closed, and locked it. When she turned back to James, her hands were shaking. "How do you know that designation?" she whispered. "Robert made me swear never to mention it. He said it was classified at levels that didn't officially exist." James pulled out his notebook and opened it to a page with the wing symbol. "Because I served with the unit, under Colonel Hayes, and I think what they hid at that base is still there, under my hangar." Sarah sank into a chair by the window. "Robert told me, right before he died, that there were things buried at Harrison that the government wanted to forget about. He said if anyone ever came looking, if anyone who knew the old codes ever showed up, I should help them. He said it was a debt that needed to be paid." She looked up at James with tears in her eyes. "What's buried there?" "I don't know yet," James admitted. "But the floor markings are coordinates. They lead to a sealed section beneath the main floor. And Sterling knows something. He went from mocking me to threatening me in less than a day." Sarah stood up, her resolve hardening. "Robert left me his engineering equipment, his ground-penetrating radar, his excavation tools. He made me promise to keep them maintained. Said someone might need them someday. I always thought he was being paranoid." She walked to the back room and returned with a laptop and what looked like a modified metal detector. "This is GPR, ground-penetrating radar. We can scan the floor without digging, see what's down there. Robert showed me how to use it. Sterling will notice if we're there during the day," James said. "He's probably having the place watched." "Then we go tonight," Sarah replied. "I have a truck. We load the equipment, wait until after midnight, and see what your 50-cent investment is really hiding." As evening fell, James returned to the hangar to prepare. He had spent the afternoon carefully measuring the floor markings, translating the coordinates into a precise location. The center point was exactly where he had found the seam. He was so focused on his measurements that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him until a voice cut through the silence. "Find anything interesting, Callahan?" James turned to find a young man in a security guard uniform standing in the doorway. The patch on his shoulder read Sterling Security Services. "This is private property," James said calmly. "I'm the legal owner. You're trespassing." The guard smirked. "Colonel Sterling sent me to conduct a safety inspection. This structure is a hazard. It's my job to document violations." He held up a camera and started taking pictures. James recognized the strategy. Sterling was building a case to have the property condemned, to force him out through official channels. The guard walked slowly around the perimeter, deliberately scuffing his boots across the floor markings, obscuring them with fresh dirt and scratches. "You know," the guard said conversationally, "the colonel mentioned you might be difficult about this. Said old military guys sometimes get confused, think they still have authority. But this is civilian territory now, and civilians follow regulations or they lose their property." He stopped at the center of the floor, standing directly on top of the seam James had discovered. "Funny spot here, feels hollow when you walk on it." He stomped his boot down hard, and the sound echoed strangely, confirming James's suspicion that there was empty space beneath. The guard's eyes narrowed. He knelt down and started brushing away dust, revealing the seam line. Well, what do we have here?" Before James could respond, headlights swept across the hangar entrance. Both men turned to see Sarah's pickup truck pulling up, its bed loaded with equipment covered by a tarp. Sarah climbed out and walked into the hangar with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. "Evening, James. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible." She glanced at the guard dismissively. "Who's your friend?" "Sterling Security," the guard said, standing up. "Ma'am, this is a restricted inspection. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Sarah laughed. "Restricted inspection? Son, I've been doing structural surveys in this town since before you were born. My husband was the chief engineer at this base. If anyone's qualified to inspect this building, it's me." She walked past him and started unloading equipment from her truck. "James here hired me to do a proper safety assessment. You know, actual measurements and scans, not just taking pictures with your phone." The guard looked uncertain. This wasn't in his instructions. "I need to call the colonel." "You do that," Sarah said, setting up her radar equipment. "Tell him Sarah Mitchell is here. He knows better than to interfere with my work. Last time he tried, I filed complaints with 3 state agencies and his insurance premiums doubled." The guard retreated to his vehicle to make the call. James helped Sarah unload the rest of her equipment. "That was bold," he whispered. "Sterling's a bully," she replied. "But he's also cheap. He won't pay for a legal battle with me. I've beaten him twice in county court over zoning issues. He'll back off, at least for tonight." She was right. 10 minutes later, the guard drove away, but not before taking several more photos. As his taillights disappeared into the darkness, Sarah turned to James. "We don't have much time. He'll be back with the colonel by morning. Let's see what Robert thought was important enough to keep secret for 50 years. They worked quickly, setting up the ground-penetrating radar over the center section of the floor. Sarah moved the scanner in a grid pattern while James watched the laptop screen, seeing the underground layers revealed in ghostly green lines. At first, there was just concrete, then rebar and foundation work, exactly what you'd expect. But at a depth of about 12 feet, the scanner detected something different, a large rectangular void. And inside that void, shapes, regular shapes, man-made objects. "There's a chamber down there," Sarah breathed. "Sealed, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet. And it's full of something. Multiple objects, large ones." James felt his heart pounding. "Can you tell what they are?" Sarah adjusted the scanner settings, trying to get more detail. The shapes on the screen became clearer. They were long, cylindrical in places, with what looked like wings or fins. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "James, I think those are aircraft. You have airplanes buried under your hangar." They stared at the screen in stunned silence. The implications were staggering. Why would military aircraft be buried? What kind of planes were valuable enough or sensitive enough to hide rather than simply decommission? "We need to open it," James said. "Tonight, before Sterling finds a way to stop us." Sarah nodded. "The seam in the floor, it's not just decorative, that's an access panel. Hydraulic, probably. There should be a control mechanism somewhere nearby. They searched the perimeter of the seam, looking for anything that might trigger the mechanism. James ran his hands along the floor, feeling for irregularities. Near the drainage grate, his fingers found a small depression in the concrete. It was shaped like a hexagon, about the size of a quarter. "Here," he called to Sarah. "But there's no switch or button, just this indentation." Sarah brought over a flashlight and examined it closely. "It's a key slot. Not for a regular key. For a tool. Specific size, specific shape." She thought for a moment, then went to her truck and returned with a box of her husband's old tools. Robert had a set of Allen wrenches from the base. Special sizes, not standard. He said they were for maintenance work on classified equipment. She sorted through them until she found one that matched the hexagonal shape. The wrench slid into the depression perfectly. Sarah looked at James. "Ready?" He nodded. She turned the wrench. For a moment, nothing happened. Then deep beneath them, something rumbled to life. Hydraulic pumps, dormant for decades, began to whine and strain. The seam in the floor began to glow orange around its edges as pressure seals broke. With a hiss of escaping air and the groan of metal on metal, the floor panel began to rise. Slowly, impossibly, a section of the hangar floor lifted up on massive pistons, revealing a dark chamber beneath. The smell hit them first. Preservation oil. Sealed air that hadn't circulated in half a century. And underneath that, the distinctive scent of aviation fuel and metal. As the panel continued to rise, lights began to flicker on automatically below. Emergency lighting systems, still functioning after all these years. And in that growing illumination, James and Sarah saw what lay hidden beneath the desert floor. 3 aircraft. Intact. Preserved. 2 were sleek reconnaissance planes, their black paint still glossy, their lines speaking of speed and stealth. They looked like smaller versions of the famous SR-71 Blackbird, but with subtle differences in design. Prototypes, perhaps, or variants that never made it to official production. But it was the 3rd aircraft that made James's breath catch in his throat. A helicopter, modified heavily, its frame reinforced, extra fuel tanks mounted on the sides, medical equipment visible through the open cargo bay, and on its nose, faded but still visible, was a call sign painted in white letters. Angel 7, his helicopter, the one he had flown on missions that officially never happened, the one the Air Force had told him was destroyed in a training accident in 1973. They had lied. They hadn't destroyed it. They had buried it, along with the evidence of operations so classified that even the aircraft themselves couldn't be allowed to exist in official records. Sarah's voice was hushed with awe. "James, do you know what this means? These aircraft, if they're what I think they are, they're worth millions, maybe tens of millions, to collectors, to museums, to the Air Force itself." But James barely heard her. He was staring at Angel 7, memories flooding back, the missions, the men he had saved, the places he had flown that weren't supposed to exist, and he remembered why they had hidden it all. Because to acknowledge these aircraft was to acknowledge the operations they had flown. Operations that, if revealed, would embarrass governments and invalidate treaties and reopen wounds that diplomacy had carefully sealed. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him in shock. "What?" "James, this is the discovery of a lifetime. This is your proof, your vindication. You can't just—" "If we reveal this," James interrupted, "governments will claim it, they'll classify everything again. They'll take it all and bury it deeper. And the men who flew these missions, the men who died on them, they'll stay forgotten. Is that what Robert would have wanted?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. "No, he wanted the truth to mean something. But James, Sterling knows something is here. He won't stop until he has it. Then we'll have to make sure he can't take it," James replied. "But first I need to understand why this is here, why they buried it instead of destroying it." He climbed down the ladder that had extended automatically from the edge of the opening. The underground hangar was cool and dry, perfectly preserved. He approached Angel 7 slowly, running his hand along its fuselage. Inside the cockpit, sealed in a waterproof container, he found a folder. The pages inside were yellowed but legible. Mission logs, his mission logs, every operation, every rescue, every flight into places that maps said didn't exist. And clipped to the front was a letter. The handwriting was familiar. Colonel Hayes, his commander. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Hayes's death in 1989. James read it with tears streaming down his face. It explained everything. Why the aircraft were buried. Why the operations were classified beyond the normal levels. Why men like James were never acknowledged. And it ended with a single line that made James understand what he had to do. When the time is right, when you find this, make them remember. Make them see that some debts can never be forgotten, no matter how deep you bury the evidence. Above ground, the sound of vehicles approaching shattered the moment. Multiple vehicles, moving fast. James climbed back up the ladder. Through the hangar doors he could see headlights. Lots of them. Sterling had returned, and he hadn't come alone. Sterling's convoy pulled up to the hangar in a cloud of dust and gravel. 6 vehicles. 2 were marked with Sterling security logos. The others were unmarked black SUVs with tinted windows. Men poured out, at least a dozen of them, all wearing tactical gear and carrying high-powered flashlights. Sterling himself emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 men in suits. Even in the darkness, James could see the satisfied smile on the colonel's face. "Sarah, get in your truck," James said quietly. "Drive away. Now. I'm not leaving you here alone with them," she replied, but her voice shook slightly. "If you stay, he'll find a way to implicate you. Get out while you can. Call someone. Anyone. The sheriff. The newspaper. Just get help." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She quickly disconnected her equipment and loaded it into her truck. As she drove away, Sterling's men let her pass, but James saw one of them taking photos of her license plate. Sterling approached the hangar entrance with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. The 2 suited men followed close behind. In the lights from the vehicles, James could now see they weren't just any lawyers or business associates. They wore badges on their belts. Federal agents. "Callahan," Sterling called out, his voice echoing in the night air. "I thought we had an understanding. I gave you until tomorrow to reconsider my generous offer." "I don't recall accepting any deadlines," James replied, positioning himself between Sterling and the open floor panel. The lights from below cast an eerie glow upward, illuminating the hangar interior in a way that made everything look surreal. Sterling noticed the open panel immediately. His eyes widened, and for just a moment, his confident facade cracked. He had suspected something was here, but seeing proof of it clearly shook him. "What have you done?" Sterling's voice was barely above a whisper. He moved forward, but James stepped into his path. "This is private property, Colonel. Whatever's here belongs to me. Legally purchased, legally owned." One of the federal agents stepped forward. His badge read, "Department of Defense, Office of Special Projects." "Sir, I'm Agent Morrison. I need you to step away from that opening. This is now a matter of national security." "National security," James repeated slowly. Interesting how something can be worthless scrap one day and a national security issue the next. Makes a man wonder who knew what and when. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but James saw him exchange a glance with Sterling. That confirmed it. Sterling had connections inside the DoD. He had known, or at least strongly suspected, what was buried here. "Colonel Sterling contacted us with concerns about unauthorized excavation of former military property," Morrison continued. "Under the National Security Act, we have authority to secure any materials or equipment that may pose a security risk." "I haven't excavated anything," James said calmly. "I turned a key in my own property and a door opened. If there's government equipment down there, then the government failed to properly decommission this site when they sold it." The second agent, a woman named Chen, spoke up. "Regardless of how the site was sold, classified materials remain classified. We need to secure the area immediately." Sterling couldn't contain himself any longer. He pushed past the agents and walked to the edge of the opening, shining his flashlight down into the underground chamber. When he saw the aircraft, his reaction was visceral. His hands trembled. His breathing quickened. "Do you know what these are?" Sterling said, his voice filled with awe and greed. "Do you have any idea what collectors would pay? What foreign governments would pay?" "So that's what this is about," James said quietly. "Not national security, not regulations. You want to profit from them." Sterling spun around, his face flushed. "Profit? You self-righteous old fool. These aircraft were abandoned, forgotten. They've been sitting here for 50 years serving no purpose. I can put them to use. I can fund my research programs, advance aerospace technology, or we can let them rot here because of some misguided sense of sentiment." "They're not forgotten," James said. I flew that helicopter. Angel 7. I know what missions it ran. I know why they buried it instead of destroying it. Morrison's attention sharpened. You have knowledge of classified operations? I am a classified operation, James replied. Or I was. One of the ones that never officially happened. One of the ghosts that men like Sterling want to profit from. Sterling laughed, but it was a harsh, ugly sound. Ghosts? You're a washed-up old man with delusions of importance. Whatever you think you were, whatever you think you did, it doesn't matter anymore. This is the real world. This is about resources and value and making practical decisions. He turned to the agents. Secure the site. Remove him if necessary. I want a full inventory of everything down there by morning. But Morrison was looking at James with new eyes. Sir, what was your rank and unit? I never held a rank, James said. I was a civilian contractor, pilot and medic. I worked under Colonel Raymond Hayes with the 437th Strategic Operations Wing. The effect was immediate. Both agents went rigid. Chen pulled out her phone and stepped away, speaking urgently to someone. Morrison's professional neutrality cracked. The 437th, he repeated. That designation is sealed under executive order. How do you know that name? Because I flew for them, James said simply. 72 missions into places that don't appear on maps. I pulled out men the government had declared killed in action. I flew supplies to operations that were never authorized. And when it was over, they told me to forget it all. To go back to being nobody. Sterling's face had gone from flushed to pale. That's impossible. The 437th is a conspiracy theory. Internet nonsense. There's no proof it ever existed. You're standing above the proof, James said, gesturing to the underground chamber. 3 aircraft, all bearing the markings of operations that officially never happened. And you knew, Colonel, or you suspected. That's why you wanted this property. That's why you brought federal agents instead of local police. Chen returned, her expression grave. She whispered something to Morrison. He closed his eyes briefly, as if dealing with a painful headache. Mr. Callahan, Morrison said carefully, I need you to understand something. If what you're saying is true, this is beyond my authority. This is beyond the Department of Defense. There are procedures for this kind of discovery. Protocols. Protocols that involve burying it again, James said. Making it disappear. Classifying it until everyone involved is dead, and it doesn't matter anymore. It's not that simple. It never is, James interrupted. But here's what I know. Those men who flew these missions, who died on them, they deserve better than to be erased. They deserve to be remembered. And I'm not letting you or Sterling or anyone else take that away. Sterling had regained some of his composure. This is ridiculous. Morrison, you have your authority. Secure the site. Arrest him if you have to. I want access to those aircraft. Access. A new voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned to see Sarah's truck returning, but she wasn't alone. Behind her were 3 more vehicles. A sheriff's cruiser, a van with a local news station logo, and a sedan that looked official but unmarked. From the sedan emerged a man in his 60s wearing a military dress uniform. The stars on his shoulders caught the light. 2 stars. A major general. The general walked with the measured pace of someone who commanded attention without demanding it. He approached the group at the hangar entrance, his eyes taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Evening, gentlemen, the general said. His voice was calm but carried absolute authority. I'm Major General David Warren, Air Force Materiel Command. Someone want to tell me why I'm receiving emergency calls about a civilian property dispute that involves classified aircraft? Morrison and Chen immediately saluted. Even Sterling straightened his posture unconsciously. Sir, Morrison began, we received reports of unauthorized excavation of former military assets. We're here to secure. You're here because Colonel Sterling called in favors, Warren interrupted. I know. I've spent the last 2 hours on the phone unraveling exactly how this situation developed. He turned his gaze to Sterling. Colonel, you're retired. You have no authority over military assets, and your attempts to use DoD connections for personal gain are being documented as we speak. Sterling's face went red. General, with respect, I was trying to protect national security. This man is James Callahan, Warren said quietly. Call sign Angel. One of the finest pilots who never officially flew for us. The general walked past everyone and stopped directly in front of James. Mr. Callahan, I've read your file. Or rather, the file that doesn't officially exist. Colonel Hayes made sure certain records were preserved, even if they couldn't be acknowledged publicly. James felt his throat tighten. You knew Ray? He was my instructor at flight school, Warren replied. Before he went into special operations, before the 437th, he talked about you, though he never used your name. He called you the best of us. The one who did it not for rank or recognition but because it was right. The general glanced down at the underground chamber, then back at James. He also told me that if this day ever came, if someone ever opened this cache, I should make sure the truth didn't get buried again. He turned to address everyone present. As of this moment, this site is under direct Air Force jurisdiction. Agent Morrison, Agent Chen, you're dismissed. This is no longer a DoD law enforcement matter. Morrison looked relieved. Yes, sir. What about Colonel Sterling? Warren's expression hardened. Colonel Sterling is about to have a very interesting conversation with the Inspector General about misuse of government connections and attempted theft of military property. I suggest he lawyer up. Sterling opened his mouth to protest, but Warren cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. You wanted these aircraft for profit, Warren said, his voice like ice. You saw dollar signs where you should have seen sacrifice. You saw opportunity where you should have seen honor. And you tried to use the government you claim to respect as a tool for personal enrichment. That ends now. He turned to the sheriff, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. Sheriff, please escort Mr. Sterling from the property. If he resists, arrest him for trespassing. As Sterling was led away, sputtering protests that no one acknowledged, Warren walked to the edge of the underground chamber. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the aircraft below. Angel 7, he said softly. Ray told me about her, said she saved more lives than any weapon system ever built. She did, James confirmed. And the men who flew in her, the men who trusted me to bring them home, they deserve better than to be forgotten in a hole in the ground. Warren nodded slowly. I agree, which is why I'm not going to classify this again. I'm going to do something that's going to give a lot of people in Washington heartburn. He pulled out his phone and made a call. This is General Warren. Connect me to the Secretary of the Air Force. Yes, I know what time it is. Tell her it's about the 437th. She'll take the call. As Warren stepped away to make his call, the news crew was setting up their camera. Sarah approached James, her eyes shining with tears. I called everyone I could think of, she said. I didn't know if it would help. You saved everything, James replied. If you hadn't brought witnesses, Sterling would have won. The reporter, a young woman with determined eyes, approached them. Mr. Callahan, is it true you flew classified missions during the Cold War? Can you tell us about these aircraft? James looked at the general, who had finished his call and was walking back toward them. That depends, James said, on whether the truth is still classified. Warren smiled. It was the first genuine smile James had seen from him. Mr. Callahan, as of 5 minutes ago, the Secretary has authorized selective declassification of 437th operations. You're free to tell your story. Finally, the weight that James had carried for 50 years seemed to lift from his shoulders. He looked at the reporter, then at the camera, then down at the aircraft that represented so much pain and pride. Then yes, he said quietly, I can tell you about them. I can tell you about the men who never came home, and about the missions that saved the ones who did. As the camera lights came on, James began to speak, and for the first time in half a century, the ghosts of Angel 7 started to become real. The camera's red light glowed in the darkness as James began to speak. The reporter held her microphone steady, but her hands trembled slightly. She sensed she was documenting something that would change history. In 1967, James started, his voice quiet but clear. The United States was fighting a war that was tearing the country apart. But there was another war happening, one that nobody talked about. Operations in places we weren't supposed to be. Men going missing in countries where we officially had no troops. General Warren stood beside him, nodding slowly. His presence was an official endorsement, a statement that what James was about to reveal was authorized. The 437th Strategic Operations Wing was created to do what couldn't be acknowledged. We went into Laos, Cambodia, even into China on 2 occasions. We extracted men who had been declared killed in action because admitting they were alive would mean admitting where they had been. James pointed down at Angel 7. That helicopter flew 83 missions. Not the 72 I flew personally, but 83 total. Different pilots, different crews, but always the same purpose. Bring our people home. The reporter found her voice. Why were you never acknowledged? Why hide this? Because acknowledging us would mean acknowledging the operations, James explained. Treaties would have been violated. International incidents would have erupted. It was decided that some secrets were worth keeping, even if it meant the men who kept them would never be thanked. He pulled out the folder he had found in Angel 7's cockpit. Colonel Hayes, my commander, he knew this day might come. He left instructions. He buried these aircraft not to hide them forever, but to preserve them until the time was right to tell the truth. General Warren spoke up. The Secretary of the Air Force has authorized me to officially acknowledge the existence of the 437th Strategic Operations Wing and to declassify selected operations records. What Mr. Callahan did, what the men and women of his unit did, will now be part of the official historical record. Sarah, standing just outside the camera frame, wiped tears from her eyes. My husband knew. He helped hide these aircraft. He kept the secret his entire life. Robert Mitchell was a good man, Warren said. He understood that some truths have to wait for their moment. This is that moment. The reporter pressed forward. These aircraft, what will happen to them now? Warren looked at James. That's not entirely my decision. Legally, Mr. Callahan purchased this property and everything on it. The Air Force can make a claim, certainly, but I think there's a better solution. He turned to face James directly. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson has been trying to document the history of special operations for years. We have gaps, missing pieces, aircraft that were lost or destroyed. If you were willing to donate these aircraft, we could create an exhibit, a permanent memorial to the 437th and all the classified units like it. A memorial, James repeated softly. He looked down at Angel 7, remembering the men whose lives had depended on that machine. Yes, but not just for the 437th, for all of them, all the units that operated in the shadows, all the men and women who served without recognition. Agreed, Warren said. He extended his hand and James shook it. The camera captured the moment, a general and a forgotten pilot, finally acknowledging a debt 50 years overdue. But the night wasn't over. As the interview continued, another vehicle approached. This one moved slowly, carefully. It was an old pickup truck, its paint faded, its engine sounding tired. The driver who emerged was ancient, easily in his 90s. He moved with a cane, each step deliberate and painful. But his eyes were sharp and they fixed on the underground chamber with an intensity that silenced everyone. I heard on the radio, the old man said, his voice cracking with age and emotion. They said someone found Angel 7. They said James Callahan was here. James stared at the man, recognition dawning slowly. The face was wrinkled now, the body frail, but the eyes were the same. Martinez? Captain Carlos Martinez, the old man confirmed. Though I wasn't a captain when you knew me, I was just a scared 20-year-old kid bleeding out in a rice paddy in a country I couldn't pronounce. He moved closer, tears streaming down his weathered face. March 14th, 1968. My patrol was ambushed. I took shrapnel to the chest. Everyone else was dead or dying. We were 40 miles inside Laos, in a valley so remote our own maps didn't show it. Martinez pointed at Angel 7 with a shaking hand. You came alone. No escort. No backup. You landed in a hot zone under fire, loaded 4 of us into that bird, and flew us out while they shot at us the whole way. The Army listed us as killed in action because admitting we survived would mean admitting where we had been. James felt his own tears falling now. I remember. You kept apologizing. You thought you were going to die, and you were apologizing for bleeding on my helicopter. You told me to shut up and hold pressure on the wound. Martinez laughed through his tears. You told me I wasn't allowed to die because you had a perfect record, and I wasn't going to ruin it. The two men embraced, decades of separation and silence finally broken. The camera captured it all. There were 3 others with me that day, Martinez said. Jackson, Williams, and Chen. Do you know if they... Williams died in 73, James said quietly. Training accident officially, actually a heart attack. Jackson made it to 85, cancer. But Chen, last I heard, Chen was still alive, living in Oregon. Martinez nodded, processing the information. We never spoke about that day, not even to each other. We were told to forget, to move on, to never mention the place we had been, or the people who saved us. He turned to General Warren. Sir, I don't know what authority you have here, but I want to testify. I want to go on record. James Callahan saved my life, and he never got a medal, never got recognition, never got anything but orders to stay quiet. Your testimony is noted and appreciated, Warren replied, and it won't be alone. I've already received calls from 6 other veterans who heard the news broadcast. They're on their way here now. Men who were pulled out of impossible situations by Angel 7 and her crew. As if summoned by his words, more vehicles began arriving. Old pickup trucks, sedans held together with rust and determination, even a motorhome that looked like it had crossed half the country. From each one emerged men and women of advanced age, moving slowly but with purpose. They gathered at the hangar, a silent congregation of ghosts made flesh. Some were in wheelchairs, others walked with canes or walkers. But they all shared something. They all owed their lives to operations that officially never happened. One by one, they approached James. Some embraced him. Others simply shook his hand. Several couldn't speak through their tears. But each one carried a story, a memory of the moment when Angel 7 appeared through smoke and chaos to carry them home. The reporter and cameraman worked frantically to document it all. This wasn't just a news story anymore. It was history reassembling itself, piece by piece, witness by witness. An old woman in a wheelchair rolled forward. Her name tag from a veterans organization read Eleanor Grant. I wasn't in combat, she said, her voice strong despite her age. I was a nurse. We ran a field hospital in a village that didn't exist on any map. When it was overrun, we were told there would be no extraction. The government couldn't acknowledge we were there. She looked at Angel 7 with something like reverence. You came anyway. You loaded 12 of us into that helicopter. It was designed for 6. You flew overweight, barely clearing the trees with wounded hanging out the sides. You got us all out. James remembered. The weight of that flight had been terrifying. The helicopter had struggled with every foot of altitude, but he had refused to leave anyone behind. I went on to run 3 VA hospitals, Grant continued. I trained hundreds of nurses. I saved countless lives. But I only got to do any of that because you saved mine first. And I never got to say thank you. You don't need to thank me, James said. Yes, I do, Grant replied firmly. We all do. Because you did it not for recognition or reward, but because it was right. And that's the rarest kind of courage there is. General Warren watched the growing crowd with visible emotion. He stepped away to make another phone call, and when he returned, his expression was grave but determined. I've spoken with the secretary again, he announced to the assembled group. She's going to recommend to the president that a special citation be created. Not a traditional medal because what you all did exists in a gray area of military law, but an official acknowledgement. A presidential recognition of service to the nation under circumstances that couldn't be acknowledged at the time. He looked at James specifically. It won't change what happened. It won't give you back those 50 years of silence, but it will make sure that history remembers, that the official record includes your name and your service. James shook his head slowly. I don't need recognition, General. I never did this for that. I know, Warren replied. That's exactly why you deserve it. The crowd murmured agreement. Martinez spoke up again. James, you always said your reward was seeing us come home. Well, we did come home. We lived full lives because of you. We had families, careers, grandchildren. That's not abstract. That's real. And we need the world to know who made it possible. As dawn began to break over the desert, the full scope of what had been uncovered became clear. This wasn't just about 3 hidden aircraft. It was about exposing a hidden chapter of history, about acknowledging sacrifices that had been deliberately obscured. The reporter wrapped up her interview, but she knew the story would run for days, maybe weeks. National news networks were already calling her station, demanding the footage. Within hours, James Callahan's face would be on screens across the country. But in that moment, as the sun rose over the hangar and Angel 7 sat exposed after 50 years in darkness, something else happened. Something that no amount of planning or official authorization could have orchestrated. The veterans, those fragile survivors of operations that never officially occurred, began to sing. It started with Martinez, his voice cracking but determined. It was an old song, one from the war. Others joined in, their voices creating a chorus that was imperfect but powerful. James stood among them, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what Colonel Hayes had meant in his letter. Make them remember. Make them see that some debts can never be forgotten. The ghosts were no longer ghosts. The secrets were no longer secret. And the man who had spent 50 years in silence was finally, impossibly, heard. General Warren stood at attention and saluted, not to a superior officer but to history itself, to the men and women who had served in the spaces between official acknowledgement and complete denial, to the ones who had done what was necessary even when they would never be thanked. Sarah approached James with a folder. The news station wants to do a full documentary. The museum is sending a team to properly extract the aircraft, and there are 17 more calls from veterans who heard the broadcast and want to share their stories. James looked at her, overwhelmed. I don't know if I can handle all this. You don't have to handle it alone, she replied. We're here, all of us. After 50 years of silence, you've got an army of witnesses ready to tell the truth. As the morning light grew stronger, James made a decision. He would tell every story. He would name every name he could remember. He would make sure that the men and women who had trusted him to bring them home would never be forgotten again. But first, he had one more thing to do. He climbed down into the underground chamber and approached Angel 7. He placed his hand on her fuselage, feeling the cold metal that had once been warm with engine heat and purpose. We did it, he whispered to the silent machine. We brought them all home, every last one. And in that moment, in the growing dawn, surrounded by the living proof of missions that never officially happened, James Callahan finally allowed himself to believe that perhaps some debts, no matter how deep they were buried, would always find their way back to the surface. 6 months had passed since that night in the desert when James Callahan opened a door that had been sealed for half a century. The world had changed in ways both large and small. The hangar was no longer abandoned. Construction crews had spent weeks carefully excavating the underground chamber, extracting the 3 aircraft with the precision of archaeologists unearthing ancient treasures. Angel 7 and her companions now rested in climate-controlled facilities at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, awaiting the grand opening of a new exhibit. But James wasn't there to see the final preparations. He stood instead in a place he never thought he would be invited, the East Room of the White House, surrounded by men and women who, like him, had served in operations that officially never existed. They were old now, this gathering of ghosts. Wheelchairs and walkers were common. Several were too ill to travel and watched via video feed from hospitals and nursing homes. But they were here, in spirit if not always in body, to witness something unprecedented. The President of the United States entered the room. The assembled crowd struggled to their feet, those who could. The President immediately gestured for them to sit. Please, please, she said warmly. You've all stood enough in your lives. Today you sit, and the nation stands for you. James felt his throat tighten. Beside him, Martinez squeezed his arm. On his other side, Eleanor Grant sat in her wheelchair. Her eyes bright with tears, she refused to let fall. The President approached a podium adorned with the presidential seal. Behind her stood General Warren and several other high-ranking military officials. And in the front row, in a place of honor, sat Sarah Mitchell, holding a folded flag that had belonged to her late husband. We gather today, the President began, to correct an injustice that has lasted for more than 50 years. Not an injustice born of malice, but one born of necessity, of circumstances that required good people to do extraordinary things in complete silence. She paused, letting her words settle over the room. The men and women in this room served their country in ways that could not be acknowledged. They flew into places that didn't exist on maps. They rescued people who were officially already dead. They carried out operations that, if revealed at the time, would have destabilized international relations and endangered countless lives. The President looked directly at James. And they did it not for medals or recognition or parades. They did it because it was right, because lives depended on them, because someone had to stand in the gap between what was officially possible and what was actually necessary. She lifted a document from the podium. By executive order, I am today establishing the Presidential Unit Citation for Classified Service. This citation acknowledges units and individuals who served with distinction in operations that were classified at levels requiring complete operational security, including denial of the operation's existence. A murmur went through the room. This was more than symbolic. This was official. This was history being rewritten to include the chapters that had been torn out. The first unit to receive this citation, the President continued, is the 437th Strategic Operations Wing, and all personnel who served with it between 1965 and 1976. Their actions saved an estimated 247 American lives and an unknown number of Allied personnel. She set down the document and picked up a medal. It was unlike any military decoration James had ever seen. Instead of the traditional ribbons and stars, it was a simple silver disc engraved with a door, half open, with light streaming through. This medal, the president explained, represents what these men and women did. They opened doors. They brought people through from darkness into light. They created possibilities where none officially existed. She stepped down from the podium and approached James. Captain James Callahan, though you never held official rank, you are recognized today as the soul of the 437th. 83 missions flown, 209 people brought home, 0 losses under your command. James tried to stand, but the president gently placed a hand on his shoulder, keeping him seated. You don't need to stand, Captain. You've earned the right to sit while your country stands for you. She pinned the medal to his chest, right next to the small, tarnished piece of shrapnel that he still wore. The juxtaposition was striking. Official recognition beside the unofficial token given by a frightened young officer in a jungle 50 years ago. Thank you, the president said simply. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for your silence when silence was necessary, and your voice when the time came to speak. She moved on to Martinez, then to Grant, then to each veteran in the room, presenting each with their medal, speaking personally to each one. The ceremony took hours. Nobody complained. This was time that had been owed for half a century. When the official ceremony concluded, a reception was held in the state dining room. James found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, to hear his stories, to thank him. It was overwhelming and exhausting and wonderful. General Warren found him during a quiet moment. How are you holding up? Honestly, James replied. I keep waiting to wake up and find this was all a dream. Warren smiled. I understand. For what it's worth, this wouldn't have happened without you. Sterling's greed inadvertently gave us the opening we needed. His attempt to profit from your discovery exposed something that needed to be exposed. What happened to him? James asked. I haven't heard anything since that night. He's facing federal charges, Warren said. Misuse of government connections, attempted theft of military property, and about 6 other violations. His companies lost their defense contracts. He's essentially ruined. The general paused. But here's the interesting part. His father's diary was found among his effects. Turns out his father had written extensively about the day you saved his life. Marcus never knew because his father died before they could reconcile after a falling out. James felt a pang of sadness. So he tried to profit from the very thing that gave him his father. Irony can be cruel, Warren agreed, but perhaps instructive. The preliminary hearing is next month. If you're willing to testify about the operations and their importance, it would help the prosecution establish why what he tried to do was so egregious. I'll testify, James said, not for revenge, but because the truth matters. Sarah approached them, her eyes red from crying. James, there's someone here who wants to meet you. She flew in from Oregon. She stepped aside and James saw a woman in her 70s approaching. She moved with a cane, and her face bore the marks of a hard life, but her eyes were bright with intelligence and humor. Captain Callahan, the woman said. I'm Linda Chen, though you knew me as Corporal Chen. Rice paddy in Laos, 1968. James's eyes widened. Martinez said you were still alive, but I didn't dare hope. Oh, I'm alive, Chen laughed. Stubborn and ornery and too mean to die, according to my grandchildren. I run a bookstore in Portland. 5 grandkids, 3 great-grandkids, and I owe every single one of them to you. They talked for nearly an hour, filling in the gaps of 50 years. Chen had become a teacher after the war, then opened her bookstore when she retired. She had never married, never had children of her own, but had fostered dozens of kids over the years. I figured, she said, that you gave me my life back. The least I could do was help some kids who needed someone to believe in them. Pay it forward, you know? As the reception wound down, James found himself back in the East Room, alone for a moment. He looked at the medal on his chest, then at the tarnished piece of shrapnel beside it. A voice spoke from behind him. They're both beautiful, you know. James turned to find an older man, easily in his 80s, standing in the doorway. He wore a suit but moved with military bearing. His eyes were kind but carried the weight of experience. "I'm sorry," James said. "I don't think we've met." "David Wallace, Jr." The man introduced himself, extending his hand. "My father was the captain you pulled out of that jungle, the one who gave you that pin." James felt the world tilt slightly. "Your father died 3 years ago," Wallace said gently. "But he never stopped talking about you. He spent the last decade of his life trying to find you, to thank you one more time. He left letters with the Pentagon, with the VA, with anyone who would listen, saying if a man named James Callahan ever came forward, he should be given everything, every honor, every recognition." Wallace reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "He also left this, instructions that it should be given to you if you were ever found." With shaking hands, James opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in a careful hand that he recognized from mission briefings long ago. "James," it read, "if you're reading this, then the world finally knows what you did, what we did. I want you to know that not a day went by that I didn't think about that jungle, about the moment you appeared through the smoke like an angel of mercy. You saved my life. But more than that, you taught me what service really means. It's not about recognition or reward. It's about doing what's right when no one is watching, when no one will ever know. You embodied that principle, and you inspired everyone who flew with you to do the same. The world is better because you were in it, and I am forever grateful that I got to know you, even for that brief time. Your friend always, David Wallace." James couldn't hold back his tears anymore. They fell freely, and he didn't care who saw. Wallace Jr. placed a hand on his shoulder. "He also left something else," Wallace said. He pulled out a small box and opened it. Inside was a medal, a silver star. "This is the one they gave him for that mission. He always said it belonged to you. He tried to have it transferred, but the bureaucracy made it impossible. So I'm giving it to you now. Not officially, but personally. From one soldier to another. From my father to you." James held the medal, feeling its weight. "I can't accept this. He earned it." "No," Wallace corrected gently. "You both earned it, but only he could receive it because only he officially existed. That injustice ends today." The next day, James returned to the hangar in the desert. It was different now. Clean, restored. The holes in the roof had been patched. The floor gleamed. And in the center, where the underground chamber had been, was a memorial plaque. It listed the names of every member of the 437th who could be identified. And at the top, in letters that caught the desert sun, were the words, "Some doors are opened in darkness so others can walk into light." Sarah stood beside him, reading the inscription. "Robert would have loved this," she said softly. "He made it possible," James replied. "He kept the secret. He maintained the equipment. He was part of this too. They're adding his name to the memorial," Sarah said, "and the names of all the support personnel who helped hide and preserve this place. The engineers, the mechanics, the security guards who looked the other way, everyone who was part of the silence." James nodded. "Good. They earned it." A car pulled up, and Martinez got out, moving slowly, but with determination. "Thought I'd find you here," he said. "Can't stay away from her, can you?" "Angel 7's at the museum now," James said. "This is just the place she slept. But it's where she woke up," Martinez replied. "That matters." The three of them stood together in the restored hangar, looking at the memorial, remembering the ghosts that had finally been given names and faces and recognition. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked James. "You've got the medal, the recognition. The documentary is being shown nationwide. What's next?" James thought for a moment. "I'm going to tell the stories. All of them. Every mission I can remember. Every person I pulled out. I'm going to make sure that the men and women who trusted me to bring them home are never forgotten again." He looked at Martinez. "And I'm going to find the families of the ones who didn't make it, the ones who died in places that didn't officially exist. Their families deserve to know the truth." "That's going to take years," Sarah observed. "Good," James said with a small smile. "I've got nothing but time, and 50 years of silence to make up for." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, James Callahan stood in the doorway of the hangar that had changed everything. He thought about the boy he had been when he first learned to fly, about the man he had become during those secret years, about the decades of silence that followed, and he thought about the future, about the stories that would be told, the names that would be remembered, the debts that would finally be acknowledged. The door had been opened. The light was streaming through, and after 50 years in the shadows, James Callahan was finally home.